Right, hello. So, Celestials, huh? For the longest time, this set used to be pretty bad. I mean, back in the core days, you didn't really have a lot to work with, and it did find its way into at least some competitive builds, but really, it's hard to call yourself a jack of all trades if you're barely a novice at two of those. Once Heart of Thorns, and God forbid later, Path of Fire rolled around, we were getting more focused and diverse stat sets, and a sharp increase in the quality of Buildcraft. Celestials, outside of maybe some fairly niche competitive builds, was really not cutting it anymore. That is, until ANET decided to break up some of the internal caps of how many stat points a piece of gear is allowed to have, and added concentration and expertise to Celestials. Ever since then, it's become a staple, especially popular amongst open world players who want a piece of each and every pie available, and probably even more importantly, lots and lots of survivability. It's almost kind of like easy mode for making builds. You can slap it on just about anything and call it OP because you don't really have to try while playing it. Or can you? Well, certainly some builds seem to make better use of it than others. But what actually makes a good Celestial build? And why is it that when they are so comfortable to play solo, for group content they, certainly at least in my opinion, are some of the hardest builds to play well? Well, strap in and get comfortable because this is going to require us to take a tour through some of the Buildcraft fundamentals, from stats to party roles, to really understand what makes these things tick. Now, I still have to get my typical disclaimer in. While I'm gonna be talking about both open world and group content, as well as their discrepancies, I'm not going to be discussing the competitive modes, so PvP and Worlds vs. World. Their Buildcraft is a thing all on its own, and something that I'm not equipped to give you solid information on. Pun intended. So let's start with what actually makes a good Celestial build from the perspective of open world. The long and the short of it is, you actually have to use all of the stats Celestial gives you. And these can be separated into 5 categories: power stats, condi stats, defensive stats, healing stats, and boon stats. And yes, I know 2 of those have only 1 stat in it, but it sounded better, okay? Here, you can't just group healing power and concentration under one support umbrella. They require you to put different things into your build to make them useful. It's a bit like squares and rectangles. Every healer is a support, but not every support is a healer. For our criteria of using every stat, defense is by far the easiest to knock out. Are you in combat? Yes. Well, then you're using your defenses. If you're not in combat, I really can't recommend Celestial gear. It's far too expensive to just be a skin holder. While we're still talking about open world, we can also look past healing power, because while you might prefer to lean more into the healing aspect of Celestials, you do have a healing skill, so it's not like you're totally wasting the healing power. Which allows us to actually get down to the interesting parts, the stat groups that we at least kind of have to build around. Those being power, condi, and boon. Well, okay, maybe power is a bit of a stretch. After all, every skill has some power damage on it. When making Celestial builds, something you might have noticed if you've already looked at some Celestial builds is that they tend to lean more heavily into condi. That is because condi requires fewer raw stats to output higher damage. After all, there's only 2 condi stats and 3 power stats. That alone kind of should give you an idea. Which means that often, if you want to incorporate more healing into your Celestial build, power damage is the place where you start trading things out first. But something to keep in mind when making these builds is that there are some weapons that are just better at doing things with hyper damage than others. A really good example for this is Necromancer's Scepter versus Pistol. For meta builds, they have both been used as pure condi weapons. And it's not hard to see why. They have really good condi skills on them. And Necromancer as a class often has a little bit of an easier time leaning into the condi side of things. But if I were constructing a Celestial build, now that I have the freedom to run Pistol on any spec, there's really only one of these 2 that I would consider, and that's Pistol. because aside from some other slightly incidental benefits, it just has better power damage on it, making it the superior damage-focused weapon for a Celestial build. But if we look at another example, Mesmer Axe versus Mesmer Staff, things get a little bit more complicated, because by the logic that I just posed, Axe would be the far better choice. It is a very solid Condi weapon that still has pretty good power ratios on it. Staff is basically exclusively Condi, but Staff has something going for it that Axe doesn't, and that's the ability to provide alacrity. Boons are incredibly powerful, and I hope I don't have to explain that to anyone. Even more so than concerns of survivability, finding ways to support yourself with boons is the hallmark of good open world builds. And so if I were to pick a weapon for my Celestial Mirage to use, I'd first go with Staff over Axe for its ability to give me boons. Now, in this scenario, there isn't anything keeping me from just using both, but also notice how I switched from talking about Mesmer to Mirage. It's a different story if we talk about Chrono, because Chrono doesn't care what weapons it uses to generate its boons. There, suddenly, Axe is so much better than Staff for a Celestial build, for the exact same reasons that I talked about with Necromancer, Scepter, and Pistol. It just has far better hybridized damage capabilities. Now, talking about all of that, we've already touched on a lot of the points for Condi. After all, in the context of Celestials, it's very hard to talk about one damage type without also talking about the other. Here's the thing though, power damage tends to require a lot more investment in the stats department to become whole. After all, if you can't reach a high crit chance, your ferocity just diminishes massively, and the power damage of most skills are balanced around being expected to crit at least most of the time. Condi is kind of the other way around. It only has 2 stats, and expertise is very hard to come by in large quantities, so the rest of the game is balanced around letting you do more condition damage with lower stats. But in turn, Condi tends to require more investment in your choices of skills and traits, because if you don't pick up enough skills that apply conditions, your condition damage is useless. And not only are there a lot of traits that apply more conditions, there's also many that give you extra condition duration, at least for certain conditions, which become very easy to build around. So the general way to construct a Celestial build becomes as follows. Step 1, consider your boon sources. Because we're in open world, it's enough if these are personal sources. You don't necessarily have to share them, but you at least want to have the potential ability to reach 100% uptime on those boons. Out of the boons, quickness and alacrity tend to give you the most payoff, but also require the most amount of build around. Similarly, might is extremely powerful, but its sources can sometimes be a little specific. Though here you have the benefit of being able to access generic sources of it, like the excellent Sigil of Strength. 2. Consider your conditions. Celestial builds will almost always run at least one trait line that has the option to lean very heavily into condition damage, such as Corruption, Fire, Chaos, and so on. You also want to pick condition-heavy weapons, and if you're using any utility skills that do damage, you'd prefer the ones that do conditions as well. Third, make sure you're not wasting your power. This is exactly what we talked about earlier, that when you have the ability to choose between something that is only good for Condi and something that is at least kinda good for power, you're gonna pick the latter. From there, it's up to you how much extra utility, healing, and defense you may want to incorporate over, for example, more power damage options. Which you prefer is ultimately up to you. This is an open world build after all. So now that we've had a fairly in-depth look at how Celestial builds function in open world, what about the group content? Earlier, I made the claim that Celestial builds are some of the hardest to play in group content, and while I don't know if the number one hardest to execute build ever would be a Celestial build, I think by and large they are harder than their more focused counterparts. But why would that be? Well, remember the healing power we glanced over earlier? Yeah, this is where that comes back to us. Open world Celestial builds are at their core Condi support builds that lean more heavily into defense than their meta counterparts, while also dealing a bit of power damage on the side. Group content Celestial builds are not like that. They are first and foremost healers that are also doing damage. And sometimes you're also expected to be tanking. If that sounds like a lot of things, that's because it is. I just threw out a lot of terms regarding roles, so let's take a moment to step back and examine those. Most supporting skills in Guild Wars 2 affect 5 targets. However, the typical raid or strike party has 10 people, which is, 5 times 2. Complicated, I know. Which means that you end up having 2 distinct subgroups of 5 people that are acting somewhat independently from one another. Not entirely, but at least partially. And these 5-person subgroups then share a blueprint with the 5-person fractal party. That blueprint being 1 healer, 1 boon support, and 3 DPS players. Now, what do each of these actually do? DPS is one you've probably heard before, meaning damage per second, thus meaning it's their job to do damage so that whatever you're fighting is actually going to die at some point. Most of the time, they're also intended to bring some form of non-damage, non-healing based utility to help the group complete various mechanics, but that's a secondary goal. Healers are on the complete opposite side of the damage to utility spectrum, and they've got a lot to do. Obviously, as their name implies, their primary goal is to keep people alive, and sustain their group to a degree far beyond what most damage builds could achieve on their own. Secondly, they are also typically responsible for providing a variety of boons to the group. Every healer has access to a slightly different selection, but the key ones are alacrity and quickness. In fact, healers are generally grouped by whichever one of these they can provide. And finally, healers are expected to provide a large amount of utility for whatever is necessary for the current encounter, choosing their skills and sometimes their weapons and traits to suit the situation. And then there's boon DPSs, or as I sometimes just call them, supports. They are the middle ground between these two. They're pretty much just DPS builds that also fill in the gaps in the desired utility that a healer can't fill on their own, starting by whichever of the 2 primary boons, again, quickness or alacrity, the healer doesn't provide, because at this point in the game, no single build can do both. And because both of these are so valuable, you do typically want to reserve 2 support slots per group. Now, you could argue, in theory, that you could make a group composition that's just 5 people out for themselves, providing their own boons, and that's kind of what people used to do in the pre-Heart of Thorns era. But there is a reason this 2 supports, 3 DPS composition has stood the test of time. And frankly, I have neither the time nor the nerves to go into the specific mathematics of it. So now that we have our typical group, how could Celestial fit into this? By the nature of its jack-of-all-trades status, it doesn't quite cleanly fit any one of these roles, at least not alone. Well, I told you earlier, it usually goes into the healer slot. That's because, as I said way at the start of this video, a good Celestial build doesn't waste any stats. But in the typical group composition, there is only one person that actually uses healing power, and that is the dedicated healer. Which means that as long as we're talking about there being exactly one Celestial player on the team, they're gonna go in the healer slot. Now, in theory, you could run multiple Celestials and then they kind of share some roles, but no matter how you slice it, they both still be supports whether they're sharing the healing burden or not. So by playing Celestials in a group setting, you're expected to be fulfilling the full duties of a healer while usually running fewer of their support options. You have less healing power and less room in your traits and your skills, because some of that is going to be taken up by damage, and that does have its benefits. By you dealing more damage, you're making encounters and phases go faster, giving people less chances to screw up, where they need healing. But when push comes to shove, you might not be able to push out quite as much as a full dedicated healer. And so being a good Celestials player in settings like raids, strikes, and fractals becomes a balancing act of knowing exactly when it is okay to not be quite so at the ready to heal everybody and instead focus on doing damage, and when you have to rein in that damage and be ready to drop the healing, while at the same time being able to trust your team enough that they are competent enough to deal with the reduced room for error that they have when things get dicey, that they sacrifice by running a support that does less healing. This is the tightrope act and the compromises that you're going into this with. And those have their places, those have their benefits, but it comes down to the fact that you really need to know what you're doing, and you really need to know what you're signing up for when you turn up to a raid with Celestials. Because it can be good, it can be downright powerful, in the right hands with the right team, but it's not easy to use. It is, at the end of the day, a tool like pretty much any other option you have access to for that content, but it's only when you know how to actually use those tools that they become effective. And I think there is a very unfortunate culture in the game and the community right now that the state of something's power is binary. Something is either overpowered or useless, to exaggerate a little. Even the general meta is just the things that are the most likely to work very consistently in a lot of cases. But if you understand your particular case especially well, then you will be able to find things that diverge from that meta and end up being more beneficial because you can apply them to the specific scenario. And that doesn't necessarily make these things stronger or weaker than the meta, it's a matter of context. Ultimately, it's never a stupid idea if it works, but it is a stupid idea to want to use something without knowing how or why it works. And I think that derailed a little bit, but I hope I taught you something useful. Regardless of whether you're coming into the game fairly fresh, you're a fairly casual player, or you've been playing the game for ages and you're sitting in the 1000 LI club. I've wanted to make some version of this video for a while, and I think I finally found the right words and the right examples for it. The support for these generally more discussion-orientated and theory-crafting-specific videos has been fantastic, and I gotta say thank you for that, certainly. And this is another departure from the content that I have been making in that regard, so if you liked it, if you found it informative, absolutely please let me know, so I know that it might be something that people care to see more of by, leaving a like, subscribing, commenting, whatever, the YouTube things. You know what you're doing. And with that, I don't really have anything to say anymore. Thank you, and goodbye.